My name is Ethan Baker. I'm a documentary filmmaker and recent grad here from American University School of Communication. And I'm also the director, DP, and editor of the short documentary Killin' the Kids that I produced here in the community documentary class.
Awesome. What first drew you to the story, and why did you feel it urgent to tell now?
What first drew me in was the organization as a whole, Horton's Kids, the mission and the difference that they're making in the community in terms of getting these kids off the street into a productive program where they're picking up skills and the programs that they offer, like podcast production, music production, and visual art, and really helping these kids discover that they have a purpose and that they basically dictate their own future. And what got me into the story specifically was the podcast program there that was ran out of the media lab at Horton's Kids by Kill, who is my main participant. And at the time, the story was kind of wanted to follow one of the youth throughout the program of him finding his voice through podcasting, but that ultimately took a turn, as often happens in this work. Often, make changes. But the moment that really kind of put things into perspective for me is when I was interviewing one of my participants, whose name is Taeyeon, and it was our first time ever meeting, so I kind of wanted to do a pre-interview, informal interview with him. And the question came up of life growing up there in DC and Southeast specifically. And he had mentioned just casually that he was robbed at gunpoint just a few weeks prior. And so that really took me back. That was really striking to me, just how commonplace these things are within that community. And so at that moment, I kind of knew that this story was much greater than just an after-school program, but it was a story about healing in the face of violence, in the face of systemic and destructive cycles of violence within a community, and how a young man is dealing with that and healing through the things that he's doing in this program. I think a story about gun violence, while it's a sensitive topic and often difficult to tell, I think that it's more relevant and timely than ever in this day and age, not just in the context of the community of Anacostia itself, but the nation. I will highlight that the story changed directions again, and that Kill, who is the main youth mentor there, became my main storyteller and participant. And this came to be during his interview, his first interview, which was originally just going to be kind of a supplemental secondary interview. And the question came up of who this kid was. There was a framed picture of a young man's graduation photo above the wall in the studio that they do the podcast in, and I asked him who that was, because my first day there at Horton's Kids, I had asked Taeyeon if that was him because of how similar they looked, but it was a different kid. And so Kill went on to say that this was one of his past students that he mentored years ago that had tragically passed away, had been killed due to gun violence in the community. And so at that moment, that's when I really knew for sure what the direction of story that I wanted to go with. So the story was going to be about the issue of gun violence within the community of Anacostia, but told through these two stories of Taeyeon's recent robbery and Taekwon's untimely death, essentially, through the eyes of Kill, a youth mentor who does this work, who's devoted his life to seeing that these kids succeed and are healthy and happy, essentially. But, him having to come to grips with the fact that there's kids out there that are being killed in the community due to gun violence.
And what theme was it important? What theme did you want to pull out of this story?
I'd say the main theme that kind of carries on through the story is the theme of healing. Healing through community, healing through conversation, and healing through creativity. All of these things kind of go hand in hand. Looking at Horton's Kids and the programs that they offer, like I mentioned, the podcasting, music production, and art, and there's so many more. These kids are not only coming in and picking up these practical skills that they can carry on with them, but it also offers an opportunity for conversation with each other, with their peers in the program, but also with the youth mentors there. So these kids are coming in the program with conflicts, with things that they're facing in their daily life, and the program is really an ability for them to have conversation and to build a sense of mutual understanding between them and their mentors. So that's something that I think is really key. And also the aspect of healing in Taeyeon's case. He's actively using these things that he's doing, like art and like podcasting, as a means of healing and understanding the trauma that he experienced of being robbed. And he even mentioned in the documentary, how he uses these things to kind of he goes in a different place when he's painting or when he's in front of the camera, and he forgets about these things that are going on in his life. And then also, of course, the mentorship that he's receiving from Kill. So all of these are pretty prevalent, overarching themes. Yeah.
And would you say that there is a question that you wanted the audience to wrestle with or to think about? And what would that be?
I'd say the main question that I want to leave with the audience after watching this documentary is how can mentorship act as a means of individual and community healing in the context of systemic and generational trauma and cycles of violence within communities. And not only that, but how can we better uplift those that do this kind of work, those youth mentors like Kill that devote their lives to kids that they see as their own, essentially. But how can we better uplift them and their profession and their mental health, ultimately?
And how do you think films like yours can change the way communities see themselves?
Films like this can change communities' self-perceptions of themselves, and that many often don't step back to think about just how difficult this type of work is, being a youth mentor. And this is something that Kill highlights a few times. Many don't think about just how these youth mentors survive, essentially, and how it impacts them in a psychological way, seeing these kids that they have seen grow up throughout the years experience violence and in some of the worst cases pass away due to the gun violence in the community. So I think that this documentary has the ability to allow these people in this profession to be seen in an even greater light, in a more positive way, and to let them really get the respect that they deserve, because this profession is pretty serious and it's really making a difference for these kids.
And it sounds like you've built a really nice relationship with Kill and your storytellers. So how did you navigate access, trust, and consent with your storytellers to get to your documentary?
Yeah, the themes of access, consent, and trust were really paramount in this film's success from the beginning. I don't think that this project would have come to fruition in the way that it has without this trust and mutual understanding that I sought to cultivate from the beginning. I came into this process wanting to really have, an open relationship bond with my participants, with my storytellers, and that I wanted them to feel comfortable telling me when they were uncomfortable with talking about certain aspects of their lives, of their stories. So, and there was in some cases with Taeyeon, for example, where, I would ask him about a detail of his story, or even just doing something, a particular thing on camera for B-roll, and he would say no, that he wasn't comfortable with that. And so for me, I had to learn to be comfortable with that and respect that, ultimately, respect the wishes of my participants. But also I feel that the more that I, kept coming back to Horton's Kids, spending time with my participants, we continued to build that sense of trust and mutual understanding in a deeper way, such that they began to open up with me a lot more about their stories and share things with me. But I think the way that I approached it was effective in being very cautious with this topic and allowing that trust and that understanding to grow organically.
And a follow-up to that, how did collaboration with your storyteller shape the film?
Yeah, collaboration with my storyteller shaped the film in a really key way. Like I said, from the beginning, I approached this kind of as far from the traditional extractive process of documentary storytelling, where our storyteller enters a community and takes, and kind of abandons the community afterwards. But this is, radically the opposite. I wanted to include my participants as the storyteller. This is their story. This is not mine. I'm just telling the story. So that's kind of the mindset that I wanted to have. And also for me, and I can maybe speak for some other filmmakers as well, I think we often come into these projects with the mindset of, what can you do for me? Meaning, what can my participant provide in terms of their story, their experience, their performance in front of the camera? But I don't think that that's the most productive mindset to have, and it's something that shifted throughout the process of making this documentary, and that my mindset kind of shifted more towards, what can I do for you? Meaning, how can I positively impact this community? How can I leave the community better than when I found it, in a way? And, how can I act as someone that can uplift the voices in the community that are maybe systemically or historically silenced, in a way? So that's kind of the mindset that I wanted to have.
And how did this process, how did making this film change you?
The process of making this film changed me in many ways. Overall, I feel like I've become a better storyteller in this process. But not only that, a better listener, a better observer, just a better community member and community storyteller. I'll talk about a moment that really changed my perspective on this story and on the subject was during Kill's second interview, and I was asking him kind of how he was processing the death of Taekwon and the robbery of Taeyeon, and just bad things that happened in general to the students, the kids that he mentored. And he was saying how, if he dwelled on these things, that he would be in tears every day, essentially, and he wouldn't be able to do the work that he was doing. So he went on to explain how he kind of had to compartmentalize these things and separate these things that have happened from the work that he still needs to get up and do every day. And I thought that that was really inspiring and captivating, but also sad in the sense that this is the reality, that it's so commonplace in the community that he has to do that.
What was the most difficult scene to shoot?
I think the most difficult scene to shoot was not for like the content of the scene itself, but just how impromptu it was. It was the outdoor scene with the kids when they were painting. It was a group of them. I feel like throughout this process, there were a lot of times where I felt like I wasn't prepared in terms of the equipment or the amount of people that I had access to help me on set. And in this particular instance, I probably needed at least one or two more hands because I wanted to get B-roll of the entire group and then audio of Taeyeon, and I only had my personal camera and a lavalier mic. So yeah, just learning to make the best of every situation, of every shoot, and be prepared for anything, because a lot of times, to be honest, I didn't know what I was coming out to film a lot of times because things changed there so much. So just really being prepared for anything kind of became my mindset throughout this. But I think that's kind of what community documentary filmmaking is all about.
And what was behind the scenes? I guess you touched on it a little bit, but what was behind the scenes like for your cast and crew?
The environment behind the scenes was a really positive one. The few people on set, my crew that I did have, they weren't just extra hands. They were, my support system. And it helped because they were also doing stories on Horton's kids, in close proximity to me. So we were able to kind of, bounce ideas off of one another and support one another. So that was a really beneficial thing that I had. And then also my cast, of course, my storytellers. I'm just so thankful for them and opening up their hearts, and even just Horton's kids as a whole, just opening their doors to me when I was an outsider and treating me as one of their own. And then, yeah, just for my participants of being so open with their stories and being vulnerable.
What do you think the biggest risk is when films like yours don't reach a larger audience?
I think the biggest risk that we often face in this work is just not getting our films seen at the level that we want and not gaining the impact that we want. I think that every filmmaker wants their film to be seen and change to be made as a result. Change, whether it's change in minds, change in attitudes, change in beliefs, change in policy, change in community. But I think it's often difficult, especially for, student filmmakers that are just starting out, to kind of garner this impact when there's, more seasoned filmmakers with entire teams of people that are devoted to impact campaigns and things like that. So, I'm grateful for this opportunity and for WETA, allowing our films, putting them on the big screen, on the big stage essentially, and for opening up this whole, new audience base to us and allowing us to get that reach that I think all of our films deserve. So, and it's not only benefiting us as the filmmaker, but it's really benefiting our community members in a key way and highlighting the very important work that they do and just these very important stories that need to be told and heard.
And what's one word that describes how you feel about making this film and why? If you had just one word, what would it be?
I think the first word that comes to mind is grateful. Just grateful for this entire process. Coming into it, I almost, didn't even take this class because this is my second time taking this class voluntarily. But, I'm certainly glad that I did because it was just a great experience from start to finish. Despite all of the changes that I faced and my topic and my participants, I'm grateful, I'm thankful to Horton's kids for opening their doors. I'm thankful to Kil and Taeyeon for sharing their story, for being vulnerable, for showing up even, and just for opening their heart to me and for showing that vulnerability that every filmmaker wants to see from their participants. Thankful to my crew for being there for support and for helping me when I was, uncertain about if the story was going to work out. And I'm also glad I was able to offer that support back to them.
If you could add one more message to the audience, what would it be?
I think the message I would want to leave with the audience is challenge them to think about what can they do in their community to uplift the voices in their communities that are often overlooked, that have been systemically or historically silenced. This doesn't just go for filmmakers, but this goes for everyone that wants to make a change, that has a vision and wants to be active in their community. But yeah, thinking about how they can make a positive impact on their community and uplift voices and paint stories in a positive light that often go unseen. Yeah.